Not been the easiest week in my life or my career this last week, but hanging in there.
To make this standalone so that people don't have to go figuring this out on their own, and I'm sure many fans that are tuning in already know the gist of the details. Let's lay this out from the beginning. Jon Jones' initial failed test.
Yeah, so that was July of 2017. He tested positive for approximately anywhere from 20 to 60 picograms of a long-term metabolite known as the M3 metabolite of a substance called dihydrochloromethyltestosterone, DHCMT, also known as oral turinabol.
And this was over a year ago. What was determined to be the source of this stuff?
Never determined what the source was. So Jon went through a full arbitration hearing, was never able to determine where it came from, tested all the supplements he was using, went through many interviews with USADA, had a full-on arbitration hearing. The source was never determined where it came from.
Why was his suspension so low or so short?
Well,
it wasn't determined.
So, there's many factors that go into what that suspension was. I would argue in the totality of the evidence that was presented in that arbitration that it wasn't a short suspension because really one key thing came out of that arbitration. So Jon went to arbitration before an individual by the name of Richard McLaren. Richard McLaren has an arbitration group up in Canada, and McLaren is probably worldwide known as one of the most credible guys in anti-doping. I know you had the Icarus producer, director on. The McLaren report was the report that came from all that. He basically investigated the Russian state being involved in doping in the Sochi Games and put out actually a series of reports on it, detailing that up to 1,000 Russian athletes, were breaking the rules, and the Russian laboratory was helping them get around it. So He's a very, very respected guy. He's independent of, obviously, the UFC. He's independent of USADA. He acts on his own.
And his determination was?
His determination, and I'll read you kind of what he said.
Okay.
He said, "I find that all evidence available to me leads me to conclude that the violation was not intended, nor could it have enhanced the athlete's performance." So A, non-intentional. So non-intentional ingestion. There's no argument that it was in his system, but he found the evidence to show non-intentional use. And then he went further, saying that based on the numbers of what he saw in the evidence, there was not even a performance-enhancing benefit afforded to Jon for having this long-term metabolite in his system. And I think that's significant when you talk about, hey, 15 months, that's kind of light, being that this is the second time through. I would argue that if there was an argument, that maybe it's on the higher end. And certainly, we'll talk about the California Commission. Andy Foster took that position in Jon's recent California hearing. He was a little bit critical of USADA. He thought, he's intimately familiar with this evidence, both in the previous case and this occurrence, and he also saw that there was no evidence that an independent arbitrator, made this statement and decision of Jon intentionally cheating. So if anything, I'd say that potentially there could be an argument that it was, on the higher end versus the lower end.
Because of the fact that it was an unintentional ingestion.
Exactly.
Now, what is Jon's excuse? What has Jon said, how he got this into his system?
Yeah, well, look, and it's detailed in the arbitration hearing at all. Jon fully admits that, some of the lifestyle decisions he was making, the partying and things, probably did not lead to making smart decisions and making smart choices in terms of what was being ingested in the body. But certainly his testimony was under oath that I have never intentionally cheated and did not intentionally put this substance in my body. And not only this case, but as we talk about the subsequent case here, I think you'll see that based on the numbers, coming out of his tests and based on some studies that have been done on some of these substances, it would tend to support that.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Jon test negative, then test positive for extremely low numbers? This is the initial test before we get into the most recent failed test.
He did. So
test negative, then test positive very shortly after with a very small trace amount.
Correct. So he had two negative tests on July 7th and July 8th, I believe, of 2017. And then weigh-in day, I think it was July 28th, he was positive for a very low level of the M3 metabolite. And we might as well start here. So again, going back to Icarus, remember the doctor? I mean, he's the main character in that, Rodchenkov. In 2011, he put out a study on oral turinabol. He actually, my understanding is, dosed himself and then studied the excretion of his urine and what was coming out of it over the weeks and months after, and determined that there were multiple, maybe up to 50 metabolites that once this DHCMT was ingested into the body converted into other substances, and these metabolites stayed around. He identified some short-term metabolites, some medium-term metabolites, and some long-term metabolites, specifically the M3 that John's tested positive for.
So these long-term metabolites would indicate that it was taken a long time ago.
They would stay around for the longest.
Why was he testing negative and then testing positive for these extremely low numbers?
That's a good question, and that's basically the question at point. But what was not occurring, and what has never occurred in any of John's samples, is any presence of the short and medium-term metabolites. And if you look at Rodchenkov's study, he identifies a couple of these medium-term metabolites, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, and he says these metabolites, based on his study, will stay in the body at least 22 days. Well, let's look back to the July 7th and 8th, positive tests. He's negative on July 7th and 8th for everything, for the parent compound, for the short-term, medium-term metabolites, and the long-term metabolites. Go 21 days later, so within that 22-day window, which his study shows the short and medium-term metabolites would still be showing up, and there's no presence whatsoever of the short or medium-term metabolites. Now, again, we'll get into this a little bit more, but I think the science, what it's showing, is a pulsing effect for this long-term metabolite, meaning once you ingest, whether intentionally or non-intentionally, oral turinabol into the body breaks it down, produces short-term and medium-term, which is, visible for a short and medium amount of time, and then this M3, which is produced for a long period of time. I think what the issue appears to be, and we'll get into this, the UFC program is not the only program that's seen this. There's another professional sports league that has seen it very frequently. USADA has also seen this on the Olympic side, but we're seeing this strange action with the long-term M3 metabolite, and the theory is it may be hiding in the fat tissues surrounding organs and maybe have a pulsing effect where it's released at certain times and other times you can't detect it.
And this is not the actual substance itself, but it's a metabolite.
Correct.
Which indicates a reaction to this substance?
It indicates the body breaking down the parent compound, the oral turinabol, and turning it into these other things which are stored in the body. So these metabolites are not performance-enhancing drugs. They're the result of the breakdown of the parent drug in the body.
Now, how much time is it detectable, the actual drug itself?
So pretty quick. It's a pretty quick clearance time. I think Rodchenkov's study says, maybe a week. So it's not around for very long. And that's why he conducted the study. Ironically enough, and I was going to go watch Icarus here last night, and I've had too much going on the last week to kind of refresh my mind. But apparently he knew this was part of his protocol for Russian athletes. He knew a coach that was still giving the oral turinabol to Russian athletes, and he had a falling out with the coach. So he goes off on the side and studies, hey, the parent compound is going to get in and out of the body pretty quick. It's going to be difficult to detect that. Let's try to figure out what stays around and leaves markers in the body for a long time. And so he developed these short and long-term metabolite tests and was able to catch some of this coach's athletes for using the oral turinabol.
Interesting. So the actual drug itself is gone from the system, but the metabolite remains. Now, what is the window that this metabolite is supposed to be detectable in the body? Because we're talking now, what are we at, like 18 months?
Yeah, so here's the problem.
Supposed initial ingestion?
Yep.
Because my question is, these same long-term metabolites, these existed a year plus ago? It was more than a year? How long ago?
That's the thing. So July 2017 was the initial test. So what all the experts, and we'll get through this, what all the experts are telling us is there is no evidence of re-ingestion. And most likely this is still remnants from the July 2017 test, however it was to enter into a system. And we'll go through some of these testing numbers that have shown negatives followed by very low level picogram quantities.
My question, though, was that the ingestion that happened that he tested positive for in July of 2017 indicated a long-term effect, right? It was a long-term metabolite.
Correct.
So meaning it had already been in his system for a year or so.
It absolutely could have predated. The theory the first time through was something had to have entered his system between July 7th and July 8th, those negatives, and this low picogram reading on July 28th. Over this last year, there's been a lot of study into this long-term metabolite. As I mentioned, this isn't just a UFC issue. There's another major professional sports league that, for the time being, wants to keep their testing confidential, but they've shared that information with scientists, with USADA, with myself.
Okay.
They saw it on multiple occasions, this pulsing effect over a year where you'd see
But this
positive
is well
tests.
over a year. We're talking
Correct.
2.5 years now, right? If it's a year, if in July he had taken
July
it a year ago.
2017, you were talking a year and a half, right? July
Right,
2017.
year and a half from
Correct.
July 17, but
Correct.
it could have been in his system a year prior.
I don't know. Yeah, it could have been a couple months, a year. I don't know. He had never showed up for that M3 metabolite 4. He had been tested, for it. He had been tested multiple times in the
Can you
program.
correct me if I'm wrong?
Sure.
Isn't the same level? Isn't it approximately the same picograms that exist today in 2018 that were there in 2017?
Generally, if you look, and we can go over these numbers, it fluctuates, from single digits, it never gets into triple digits to mid double digits. So there's some as low as 9 picograms over that time. There was some at 60 picograms.
And let's explain a picogram to someone because it's a preposterously small thing.
It's insane. And, the analogy that I heard early on was, and I think John used this, throw a pinch of salt in an Olympic swimming pool. And I'm like, okay, well, you kind of wrap your head around that. Let's go the other side. Let's talk about something really small that we know of and how many times you have to break down that small particle to get to a picogram. So 1 grain of salt, and we all know what that looks like, right? You put that in front of you and you split that, and I'd mentioned this week 50 million. It's actually 58 million. If you split that 58 million times, a grain of salt, each one is a picogram. I mean, it's incomprehensible, the detection level and how small that is. It really is. It's crazy.
And how many picograms did they find in his system?
So he's gone from, and I'll read through it here. So here's since the initial appearance of the M3 metabolite, here's what John's tests look like in those picogram readings. So the first one collection date was July 28th, 2017. He had a concentration of 80 picograms. However, let me caution, and I'll read something from an expert. When you get down to these picogram levels, the science is somewhat inexact because it's such a small amount. So the variable, the plus or minus, can be anywhere from 20, 30. I've seen in some instances 50 or 60. So what this scientist's name is, his name is Larry Bowers. He was formerly the USADA science director. He's currently retired and independently consults. Before that, he ran an Olympic committee accredited laboratory at the University of Indiana. The guy's got 20 to 25 years of anti-doping experience. Here's what he told me about when you're analyzing small picogram levels. Although the two respective laboratories report a concentration, I would caution against becoming too fixated on the numbers. First, the numbers are really estimates of concentration and probably should be considered a range of about plus or minus 20 picograms per ml. And he said the December 9th result would be in the range of John's, and we'll get to that, between 60 and 100. Second, while the adjustment of concentration by specific gravity attempts to deal with the variability of urinary excretion rates, it is inexact and adds variability to the estimates. Finally, and most importantly, science has no clear understanding of the variance of urinary excretion of drugs at ultra-trace concentrations. So basically saying, look, we have a general idea how this works in science, and I think this instance comes to play. Be real careful if you're going to be the guy with the pseudoscience out there saying, wait a second, John jumped from 20 to 60 from September to December, and that means he re-ingested it. What he's saying here is slow your roll on that it's such a small incomprehensible level that we don't really know what those variances are going to look like. Now, I think if we saw jumps in John from single digit 8 or 9 picogram to multiple 100-digit picograms, there would be a concern and maybe some readministration. But the experts I've spoken to, when you're talking variability of 10, 20, 30, 40, it's not that significant at the picogram level.
What is the window where this long-term metabolite starts to express itself? Like what you said, there's short-term and there's medium-term. This is the long-term. How long does it take before the long-term?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. It may be in Rodchenkov's report here, and I would encourage those that are at home, playing scientists at their computer. The Journal of Steroid Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, Rodchenkov writes a report, Detection and Mass Spectrometric Characterization of Novel Long-Term Dihydrochloromethyltestosterone Metabolites in Human Urine. I'm not sure when that long-term metabolite, how long it takes to show up. Here's the problem, though, with this substance. He did a real brief study. My understanding is administered it to himself. That's the only study that exists. Oral turinabol, DHCMT, to my understanding, is not approved for use for human consumption anywhere in any country. So you can't have clinical trials ethically in the medical world because it's just not legal to give this to human beings. So, we're already kind of behind the 8 ball here in that, as compared to other substances where you can do clinical trials because they're readily available, be a prescription or whatever, this substance is not. This substance was created by the East Germans in the 70s and 80s and was part of their state-sponsored doping program where they were doping their athletes.
And can you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe what I've read is that this is particularly effective when people are cutting weight.
Yeah, I mean...
Is that true, or is this just more...
I don't know about that. I think some may be confusing turinabol with oral turinabol, two completely
Let's
different
talk about that,
substances.
That's actually very important.
Yeah.
There's very different effects on the body. There's very different windows in terms of detection time. Explain that to me, please.
You got to be really careful in this world of performance-enhancing drugs. There's names that are interchangeable. There's different, chemical names where you change a little bit of that chemical name. It could mean a completely different substance. There's instances where the chemical name is different, but the substance is actually the same. So when trying to compare two substances, make sure if you're at home doing that analysis, you're comparing the right ones. Straight turinabol is different than oral turinabol.
What is the difference?
I can't tell you. I'm not as familiar with turinabol other than it's not oral turinabol.
So, but there is a difference in terms of the detection window?
Yeah, there would be. I mean, different substances create and throw out different metabolites, and different substances have different detection windows. So I haven't done my study and research on straight turinabol other than knowing it's different than the substance here.
So Grigory Rodchenkov, that's how you say his last name, right? He was the only guy to do an actual verified study.
Correct.
Now, has this study been peer reviewed?
Yeah, I mean, it's published in the Journal of Steroid Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. So in order to get something published, it needs to be peer reviewed.
Right. So has it been replicated anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. So it's just we have one study, which is really fascinating.
Correct.
So we know that, first of all, we know this is an effective steroid. We know it works.
Yeah, the East Germans, I think, showed that they wouldn't have been using it. It's not an easy substance to get a hold of. Look, when it's not approved for use anywhere in the world, it's only available on the black market. So you probably have to go to China to get it manufactured, or research chemical supply company. It's not supposed to be provided to humans.
Now, I'm certainly not attributing this to you, but there were rumors. This was one discussion, was that one of the possible ways he could have ingested this, and let's be very kind, John likes to party. Okay, one of the things about partying is people do cocaine. One of the things about cocaine is sometimes cocaine is cut with creatine. One of the things about creatine is oftentimes you're buying cheap creatine. Especially one of the things that we've had with Onnit. Onnit's, our products are all third-party verified, but in the initial goings, when we tried different manufacturers, especially for Alpha Brain, we found there were other trace elements that were in Alpha Brain that weren't supposed to be in there. And it's because of the vats that they mix these things up with. And one of the things that we had heard was that creatine oftentimes is made in the same place where they might be making oral turinabol, they might be making anabol, they might be making a bunch of different things, and trace amounts of this stuff can get into the creatine. They use creatine to cut cocaine with. Yeah. Is this possible, or am I just?
Yeah, it's absolutely a theory. I don't, I can't sit here and say that happened, but I will.
You have heard similar things.
I have heard similar things. I know for a fact, based on my previous career, I worked closely with the DEA. I was with the FDA. I worked cases involving street distribution of recreational drugs, including cocaine. I know for a fact that creatine is one of the most common substances that cocaine is cut with. Because it has a similar look, similar color, similar feel. So getting back to McLaren's arbitration decision, I mean, this is publicly available record, so I'm not saying anything new, but McLaren addresses at least John's lifestyle around this time, and he says the athlete openly admitted to USADA that prior to and for a period of time after the reporting of his second adverse analytical finding on July 28, 2017, the athlete used illicit so-called street drugs, including cocaine. Now, for me to sit here and say, hey, that's where it came from, I don't know that.
What's the time period he's talking about there?
The athlete admitted that prior to and for a period of time after the reporting of his second adverse analytical finding on July 27, 2017, admitted. So before that test and sometime after.
Okay. So does that make sense, though? If it's cut, if that's where the source of it is, does it make sense that would show up as a long-term metabolite? Doesn't it need a long time in the body to digest, or do we not know enough about the window of time?
Yeah, I don't know if we know enough about the window of time. You know, my theory in looking at it is even if there's a small amount of the oral turinabol in that, it's going to, for a period of time, show that parent compound at a small picogram amount and the short and midterm metabolites in the small picogram amount. We have never seen those in the history of John's testing. It's only this long-term metabolite. So that may be indication that it occurred maybe even prior to what we're talking about here.
Is it something that could be accentuated in some way by the weight cutting process?
I absolutely think that could be a factor. There are studies, not necessarily with this, but another substance, clomiphene. And look, while I'm cautioning people to be careful about comparing different substances, the commonality between clomiphene, which there are multiple clinical studies on because it is approved for use to be distributed to humans, and oral turinabol is they're both chlorinated. So they both contain a chlorine atom on the molecule. And there's a recently published study on clomiphene and its excretion rates. Again, for those at home that want to look it up, the study was published in the Endocrine Society publication. It's peer-reviewed. The name of it is HPT Axis Effects in Urinary Detection Following Clomiphene Administration in Males. So what they did is they basically, got a group of males, gave them a 1 month cycle of clomiphene, I think 25 milligrams a day, and then had them get off and then continued to look at their urine up to 261 days after. And what you saw and what you see in this study is that pulsing effect. So, I'm looking at some of the study subjects here. Subject 1, on day 121, still showed 147 picograms of clomiphene. Day 128 showed 174 picograms. Day 135 shows nothing. He's below the minimum reporting limit. And then day 149, he's back up to 236. There are 6 out of, I think, 12 subjects in that study that showed this pulsing effect of this chlorinated substance coming and going. Again, it's different than oral turinabol, but it has that common factor of being chlorinated. In this study, they do talk about a fat tissue called let me look this up and make sure I got this right, adipose tissue. This is fat that surrounds the internal organs. It's one of the last things that the body burns when it's going, starving itself and going to fat. It protects those organs. But yeah, you look at these, extreme weight gains and cuts that the UFC athlete goes through. I don't think you're going to find possibly another human subject anywhere that goes through putting weight on,
other than Olympic
cutting
wrestling.
up. Maybe, but I don't think Olympic wrestling matches with an MMA fighter. Goes through, at least, in my experience over these 3 or 4 years, talking to those in the Olympic world. I think we're at the extreme, and it's something obviously we've talked about before. We're trying to curtail, but there's clearly never been a study for anybody who dehydrates and rehydrates themselves to the extent that some of our athletes do. You could never find, there would never be anybody with any ethics that would support a study, because some of that dehydration exceeds World Health Organization standards. So there's no studies out there, on this stuff. But clearly, looking from afar, I'd say that it likely has some impact over what's being released by this adipose tissue.
We should certainly talk about that in the future, about the weight cutting aspect of it. So, but this adipose tissue loss at extreme weight cuts could potentially be the reason why this stuff is excreting itself.
It's definitely a theory out there.
What about microdosing?
So here's the thing with microdosing. Microdosing is done with endogenous substances. So
only
someone could try it with something else, but the reason you microdose with endogenous substances is they're already produced in the body.
Right.
So the theory of, okay, I'm going to microdose oral turinabol. Well, oral turinabol is still producing these short-term and long-term metabolites. In theory, whether you're taking 100 milligrams or 1 milligram of oral turinabol, those excretion rates of those metabolites are still going to be consistent. They're going to be in a much smaller level.
Is there a way to bypass those excretion rates? Is there a way to mask that in some way?
I'm not aware of any.
So the only study?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. The only study we have is Gregory Richard.
Correct.
That's it.
Correct. But, just taking it from a common sense approach, it's certainly, those that know about microdosing know that you microdose with endogenous substances, things that are already appearing in the body.
So your body knows what to do with them.
Knows what to do, and you're fooling, not only are these metabolizing and there's no metabolites of them, but you could also be fooling the biological passport. That's the concern, I think, and why people microdose. So USADA is looking, not only testing for specific substances, but are testosterone to epitestosterone ratios going up? They're looking at blood values, how many young red blood cells, how many mature red blood cells. So microdosing in those two areas wouldn't set off alarms in the biological passport world. I've never heard personally of microdosing of exogenous substances that are not found in the body. Microdosing, in my understanding, is done with things that are endogenous and already found in the body.
For people that are not familiar with this terminology, we're just talking about microdosing, performance-enhancing drugs. Because microdosing in today's world is a very common thing with mushrooms and LSD and a lot of other things.
I mean, I saw a ton of microdosing in the cycling world. That was testosterone, EPO, HGH, all those natural occurring in the body.
And so they don't produce any really red flag metabolites.
If you do them at very, very small levels, the parent will clear quickly, not produce any metabolites, and will not throw off the biological passport analysis.
Is there when Victor Conte came out with Clear and all that stuff with Balco, and they were fooling people, is it one of the things we've talked about before is that it's a constant race to try to keep up with more advanced cheaters.
It is, and you know what's interesting in this? I mean, if I would have talked to you, and maybe the first time we did talk a couple of years ago, it's come a long way from then, but clearly if I would have talked to you 15, 16, 17 years ago when I got my start in the anti-doping world, I would have told you definitively the testing is way behind, what's being used out there. They were able to test to multiple nanogram limits. That's as far down as we can go. Now they can go down to single-digit picogram. There's another professional sports league out there that recently had a 1 picogram M3 metabolite case. I mean, do the math coming down from, 4 or 5 nanograms, which used to be the lower limit, now to 1 picogram, 10,000, 20,000 times. I am almost under the theory that the pendulum has swung maybe a little bit too far in the other direction. And that certainly is part of my job to the UFC. Look, I want to catch every intentional cheater that's out there. I want to make sure we have a rock-solid program, use all the latest and greatest, techniques to do it. But I also want to keep an eye on it to make sure it's being administered fairly. And when you're getting down to detection of one, single-digit picograms, I have a concern that what kind of level of sensitivity are we talking about? Are we going to talk about environmental contamination where you walk through a room and somebody has just opened a container of something and there's, minuscule powders in the air? There are documented cases that some of the regularly prescribed prescription drugs, specifically diuretics, are getting in water supplies in some areas. You get a lot of old people on them that flush their old pills down the toilet. There's documented cases of it getting into the water supply and being detectable at that picogram level. So you've got to be really, really careful about that. And I think, this case exemplifies that USADA and really the World Anti-Doping Agency, world and community are aware of that. With greater sensitivity in testing, in my opinion, makes greater responsibility to be objective and look fairly at what really we're doing here when we're detecting in that small amount.